I'm very happy to welcome Maikel Lieuw-Kie-Song, who is an engineer who has been working on job creation for the past 20 years. Since 2015, he works at the International Labour Organization in the Employment Intensive Investment Program as a senior technical specialist, where he focused on optimizing the employment outcomes of public investments, including climate change adaptation. He has been engaged in civil engineering and international development work since 1995, in particular in the field of infrastructure development, employment creation, and small business development. Prior to the International Labour Organization, he was chief director in the South African government and was involved in the expanded public works program, which created 1.6 million temporary jobs in 5 years. And he also worked as an independent researcher and consultant in Sao Paulo. Maikel, when you're ready, you can share your screen and start your presentation.
Thank you very much, Victor, and good morning, everybody. First, apologies, I couldn't be there with you. I would have loved to. One, because I'm studied in Delft, so it would always be nice to be back, but also lived in Sao Paulo for 7 years, as Victor mentioned, so would also have been great to be able to connect with some Paulistas again. So I'll talk about decent work in nature-based solutions, which is a little bit the title of what I'll be sharing with you. So I'm going to start off with something that, I mean, maybe those from Brazil haven't noticed, but most of us in Europe have seen over the last weeks, a lot of farmer protests across Europe, protesting for a lot of things. Clearly, there's a lot of anger among them. And when you listen to what they say or try to follow what's being said, there's a lot of issues that have come out. But what clearly resonates is that there is a lot of issues around what we at ILO call just transition, right? So that now what is just transition? It's really that when we make these environmental transitions, when we want to move from what we call environmentally unsustainable economies and societies, if the transition isn't just, we see these kind of discontents. We see that people feel they are unfairly required to bear the burden of this transition, to bear the cost of these transitions, to take the risks that are associated with those transitions. While if this was just, there would have been a feeling that these risks are shared equally or fairly. But clearly in this case, or for many farmers, it felt that this risk sharing, this burden sharing is not just, and they are carrying a lot of the can of a transition that they generally, when you listen to them, all agree we need to make. So there is this, there's kind of this, the notion from our side is about, okay, we need a just transition, and the counterfactual that is essentially an unjust transition, which can either lead to environmentally sustainable outcomes, but which are not really socially sustainable, or perhaps the other way around. And I think we need to find this middle ground. So it's really about marrying the kind of environmental dimensions with the socioeconomic dimensions. And I think this is from the ILO, the main reason we are actually involved in the whole green debate is from our side to try and make it this environmental transition, to make it just and socioeconomically sustainable. So there's a set of guidelines that we have, and again, this is the whole premise for us engaging in greening, and nature-based solutions, and climate change, etc. And while this is a very busy diagram, I think the key point for us is really around policy coherence and achieving policy coherence through social dialogue. And this is, I'm very happy to have seen that many people have referred to these implicitly or explicitly already this morning. But if it's not about involvement, social dialogue essentially is about involvement of all the stakeholders in collective decision-making, about inclusion. And if we don't have that coherent, the social dialogue that builds social policy coherence across these 6 different elements from our side, there's kind of the macro sectoral policies, there's a set of employment policies, labor protection policies, and if these are not coherent, we see these tensions emerge, and we see pushback to what are, in many instances, very sound environmental goals and environmental policies. So this is then one of the reasons we embarked on this initiatives, which I lead from the side of the ILO, which is a collaboration between ourselves, IUCN, and the UNEP, UN Environment Program, which is a report series on decent work in nature-based solutions. So it's tend to be 5 reports. It coincides with the UN has launched this decade for ecosystem restoration. And it really tries to look to some of the questions I think that also have emerged this morning among some of you. On the one hand, it aims to strengthen the argument for investing in nature more broadly by showing that there are positive employment dimensions to it, but also that the environmental community is aware of the employment implications and starts, thinking about that. Of course, the aim is to inform policymaking, both on the kind of nature side and employment side. But it also asks the questions: what are the opportunities for working with nature more broadly? And this, of course, can be downloaded. So one question we asked in the report is, well, where do we find people working in nature-based solutions? And here we applied a more broad interpretation of nature-based solutions. There's a very, this process of defining is in some ways, or in setting boundaries, is still ongoing, but we took a more broad one saying, well, where are people actually protecting, conserving, restoring, sustainably using or managing ecosystems, which derives directly from the UNEP definition of NBS. And we found that people are working in these on nature through what traditionally in kind of normal economic classifications are in the agriculture and forestry sector, infrastructure and construction sectors. We see some through private enterprises, including an emerging field area of what are referred to as nature-based enterprises from some. A lot of people working through public employment programs. Actually, we found that the biggest group, if you count the people working with nature, the largest number is actually people employed through these types of programs. Also, some are in payment for ecosystem services schemes, which requires people to do a certain level of work. And then, of course, there's the question of volunteering, which is also very significant, and it's also one of the largest in terms of people working with nature. That was the second largest group globally, and so we see there's also what emerged through this is that there are also interesting opportunities for social inclusion through NBS work in NBS. So what does the work actually look like? Actually, if you look at some of the key characteristics we found globally, we see a lot of work is actually part-time, seasonal or temporary. So there is, and this is often deliberate in many programs in many countries, and especially in rural areas where people also practice agriculture. There is often programs or interventions are designed to mobilize people when they have time available to work on nature. We see the bulk are still in rural areas and related to agriculture and forestry, which to some extent makes sense because that's where nature is. There's more space for nature, and I'll come back to that. But there's also, and I think this is yourselves and many others, there is a professional and high-skilled urban work where people are involved in the design, planning, management, monitoring, research, etc. And here we see an interesting emerging of new occupations, which I'll mention a bit as well later. There's also a lot of hidden work, and we use hidden in quotation marks here because, for example, it's not hidden as such, but it's integrated into collective workforce. A big question is, for example, in the construction sector, where you kind of hybrid infrastructure, green-gray infrastructure, where it makes, and it's not easy to say whether this engineer is a NBS engineer or a green engineer or just a gray engineer who adopts certain greener elements. So, and then we also of quite a bit of what we would call, for lack of a better term, perhaps atypical employment, where we see a variety of arrangements, such as household contracts in some countries for people to manage certain areas, or we see in some countries payments that are actually more linked to social protection, payments where people receive not necessarily a wage, but a certain stipend, but in return for this, they have to do work on managing certain areas or looking after trees in urban areas, etc. And then, of course, volunteering stood out, as mentioned before, and as many of you has indicated as well, as an important element, and which, you know, is intricately linked to this question of economic models that has come up here. Like, you know, what is the economic and employment model for working with nature, actually, which raises a lot of questions. Now, a lot of work we do also is trying to assess the job impacts of transitions, and so in this report we look at this kind of transition to having more investment in nature. What we looked at is here specifically, okay, what is the investment required to meet some of the key biodiversity and land restoration goals? So this is very much at a global level. Specifically, we looked at 4 areas. If we increase investment in reforestation, silvopasture, peatland restoration, and mangrove restoration, what the employment impact would be, and we found that would generate about 20 million additional jobs globally. But this, as you see, doesn't really include any urban NBS. This is because partially there's no urban NBS global goals as such that we could easily latch onto. But also there's actually, in terms of the employment dimension of urban NBS, there's a lot that we don't know yet. And I think this forum and yourselves is for us, in that sense, a very interesting forum to be able to engage with and understand more, help us understand some of these questions. So I think it's also interesting that actually the bulk of the potential we found was not so much in high income, but more in upper and lower middle income countries. Partially, of course, because that's where most of the land restoration and biodiversity goals are linked to in those countries. There's also a big run by sector, and not surprisingly, most people would probably be working in agriculture and forestry sector, but public services is an important one as some of the other sectors. The report also has some case studies. I think I lifted out 2, which are perhaps somewhat relevant. I mean, there's one about in Melbourne about kind of the urban forest strategy, which interestingly has very specific human health objectives underlying the whole strategy. So, you know, many of the things you mentioned before, increasing canopy cover as well. And interesting for us is that actually, you know, this strategy is managed by this interesting ratio here, this 11 full-time professional team that lead and coordinate the strategy, supported by 700 volunteers in this citizen forester and Gardens for Wildlife program. And then there is a separate third element, which is kind of jobs for municipal workers or contractors who implement specific measures related to this. So it's interesting ratio of professional versus volunteer, etc. We also have a case study in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, where the driver is not so much human health, but it's really resilience, climate resilience, really against disaster risk, etc. But it involves really very active greening of Freetown. Interestingly here, it's not based on volunteers here, which I think some of you alluded to as well, that in developing countries, volunteering is often a luxury. Many people, you know, it competes in time with livelihoods. So here it's very much designed to complement livelihoods again. And there's an interesting development there of an app, you know, developed an app, smartphone-based app to do the tree maintenance. People have specific responsibility for a certain number of trees, which are mapped out in the app, and basically the app allows for basically micro payments for the key activities to domain the trees. And so here you have again a 20-time full-time jobs of people professionals managing the program, but a large number, 900 kind of part-time jobs of mostly young people who are engaged in doing the kind of ensuring planting trees, but also maintaining the trees that are kept. So, as I mentioned, the largest number of people we found globally working on nature actually were in public employment programs, and we think these are interesting. I mean, perhaps I'm somewhat biased as well from my side because it's an area I've been working on a long time. But essentially, it gives the state a vehicle for inclusion and making public investments. And I think this is one of the reasons why these programs exist in many countries, that it marries these government needs to, on one hand, foster economic and social inclusion with this need to make public investments. And here, work as a vehicle, here we specifically are in these programs, often the rationale is that work, employment, paid work is a vehicle for realizing social inclusion. At the same time, there is a lot of work to do in many countries around building the social, economic, and environmental commons. So that's type of the combination that these programs offer, as I mentioned. And they're driven publicly because the benefits that investments, and especially investment in nature and environment, really accrue to society as a whole. And so this is always the difficulty for private investors to get involved. And I think the same question applies to a large degree in cities as well, that these are wide range of benefits that accrue to society at large. So the return for a private investor is usually quite limited, but for the public sector, actually, it is very significant. And so how do you then this is why somewhat more natural vehicle is for the public sector to invest. These programs are popular, and we call them, or I refer to them as special circumstances. So I mean, they're very common in for instance, in periods of economic crisis, in areas where you have specific vulnerable groups who are not able to enter the labor market, in post-conflict zones or disaster zones, etc. And this is often where they find their origin, but they are also found in perhaps at smaller scales in many other parts of the world. They're typically more largest in rural areas, but they have also urban potential. And their rationale, and I mean, this is a bit of this slide is I often use to explain why work is important for social inclusion, because it's not only about, I think often there's economic dimension of work where people see work as a vehicle for making a livelihood, and of course that's for most people the most important one. But there are so many other dimensions to work around building a lot of capabilities that are essential for functioning socially, and which are built through work. And so designing programs and interventions to also build these capabilities, I think, is something that we advocate and encourage people to think about. I'm not going to talk too much about this here, but I mean, there are many examples of such programs around the world with a very green focus. The largest is in India, where there's this National Rural Employment Guarantee, which actually guarantees households 100 days of paid work. And a lot of the paid work that people are employed to do by government are actually around land management, land restoration, soil and water conservation, and forestation. With this program in Pakistan, this Stallion 10 billion tree tsunami, which also it's essentially organized as a public employment program where people are paid to reforest. But you see them not only in developing and also in, for instance, in New Zealand, where it's a more nuanced as well, where there's, for instance, a lot of work also around invasive species and managing those and removing those, etc. So few conclusions. Yeah, I think there is this symbiosis I think we need to explore around investing in nature, which can have important benefits for the world of work, but also the other way around, that investing in the world of work may be necessary when we think of investing in nature. There's job creation potential of this is modest compared globally. Yeah, I mean, if you look at employment needs, etc., globally, but there's also a lot of scope for job improvement potential. And here, perhaps one interesting question is around paid work versus unpaid work, and in what context, which one is the most desirable or the most appropriate. Just transition measures are really essential. So I think thinking around just transition issues around urban greening, I think, is an interesting question. That we harness social inclusion, which is which I was really pleased and very happy that many of you are already thinking around those lines. And then, as the previous speaker also alluded to, there's different ways to organize large-scale tree planting ecosystem restoration. A predominant note is public sector driven, but what are the different economic models and models to organize that? I mean, from our general work on just transition, I think it's really a few lessons that we keep sharing. I think in most forums is that really that we need to think about just transition policies from the beginning when we think about environmental policy. That policy coherence across social, economic, and environmental policies is really essential. Skilling, often overlooked, I think also has come up by some of the speakers here as well, that how do we think about green skilling or reskilling where that's relevant. Social protection, yes, depends, but in many countries there is this link to also making a transition possible through using social protection mechanisms, transfers while people reskill, etc. Protection for those whose jobs may be at risk. And then the question around how do you pay for it, and that we what we advocate generally is fiscally neutral but more progressive taxation to cover these costs. Finally, maybe I'd leave some questions to consider, but I think as part of this discussion, one is, what are the just transition questions that arise in urban greening, and how do we take them on board in planning? And one that has come out more generally in the nature space is the whole work is the question of land use and space, and how do changes in land use impact people differently. I think in an urban context is quite interesting, because urban space, you do compete with living space, transport space, and green space, and what are the things to consider there. Skills policies, what know-how and skills do we need, and are they there? Are they available? How do we build them? Social policy for inclusion, what road, how can we use greening to also foster better social inclusion, especially in countries where that's relevant. Economic policy and working with trees, paid or volunteering, or what are the, what are the ways to think about that? And then there is a question around health as well. How do we, maximize both the physical and mental health benefits of working with nature? And I think this is maybe my last point, which I referred to as well, that actually the mental health benefits of working with nature are apparently quite significant in terms of the purpose people derive and satisfaction they derive from doing so. So perhaps this is also something to harness as we go further. Thanks a lot. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Thanks a lot. And back to you, Victor.